Okay, so I have been now babbling about the European comic album format, that it's the best thing ever. So why isn't it popular elsewhere? If it's as good as I say, why hasn't it really taken off, let's say in USA? Well, to put it shortly, if you are from USA, the problem is not in the comic album format, it's in you. And by this comment, I mean that album format has already been tested years ago in the US market and it failed. And there were a few reasons for that. And one of the reasons was the size of the comic book. The US market, the stores and their displays, they were built for this size, the regular US comic book size. This is a trade paperback, but it's basically the same size as the single issues. So all the shelves were made for this size. And when suddenly someone introduces something this big to the stores, they didn't like it. It was too big. Many stores complained that it was too big. They couldn't display them well. I mean, it would be easy to say to those dealers that, well, if you just try harder, you might create a completely new market and expand your sales. But then again, I know quite a lot about the sales in dealer level, not comics, but in other businesses. So I understand that if you are really selling well with these, you have all your shelves full stacked and the stuff is moving. So it's not the first thing that you do is that you make space for something that doesn't fit your current way to sell stuff. Of course, another shock to the system for the US readers was the content. Europeans have a different way of building their comics, different way of making them, and they're not superhero stories. So selling the European adventures to reader who only wants his next Spiderman or next Batman story, yeah, it could be difficult. Then there was the complaint of the length of the books, as they were only 48 pages or 64 pages. But isn't it so that if you look at the Marvel and DC today, it's like 20 or 22 pages, the actual story. So these are 2 times, almost 3 times in certain cases, longer than one single issue of comic book. So 64 pages is more than enough for a really good and coherent story when it's well done. In most of the cases, 64 is too much and 48 is all you need for a really good story, like in the case of Batman and Killing Joke. Now let's jump back a bit to the point where I said that album has already been tested in USA and it failed. And I have experienced this firsthand myself, bitterly. I'll show you. One of my favorite ever publishers, NBM, a USA company, they translated really good European comics into English. And they also published them in album format in USA. In the 90s, when I visited the local comic book store here in Helsinki, they kept a lot of NBM comic books on their shelf. And that was the first thing I always checked out, if there's something new on those shelves. Back then, I didn't know that NBM was a US company doing this great work of translating this European stuff into English, and then they shipped it back to Europe for me to read. And I'll just show you here a few examples. Forever War. I've made a video of this earlier, and if you're interested, you can go and check it out. It's a really superb adaptation of a classic sci-fi novel. Another favorite from NBM was Wake. Originally in French, its name was Silage. This is Finnish version. They also translated 10 volumes and they published them with the Silage name. I've made a video about this series too, so if you're interested, go check it out. And then there's The Mercenary. I haven't done video about this, but I will. It's by Secrelles and it's insane. Every panel is an oil painting. This is absolutely bonkers. It's mostly fantasy stories, but there are hints of sci-fi in it too. Really great stuff. These 3 series alone show how versatile the European comic scene is. They are all very different in their art style, in their writing, and they're all really good. The writing is really good, the art is superb, and even very different type of techniques like oil paintings. I have really hard time understanding how these failed. I mean, it cannot be the content. If you read all of these and you don't like any of these, check your pulse. I mean, it's really hard not to like them. And it's almost impossible to hate them. The only thing I can think of is that they were really not available. They might have been there, but not visible. So in a way, they died in the store. And then there's a possibility that I'm just talking out of my ass and I don't know what I'm talking about. That's why I would really like to hear comments from anyone from USA. If you're watching this and you're from USA, and if you remember these or not, and you were active in the 90s in the comic store scenes, how was your experience with these comic books? Let's say NBM and other album formats. And I have to remind that this is just my theory. I have read a little bit about this, and this is how I connect the dots. As I mentioned, it cannot be the content why these failed. I think it's the size, because I'm using as my support to my theory these heavy metal magazines. The size of these magazines was very close to the regular US comics, and heavy metal became a massive hit right away. This was the platform that introduced the biggest European comics heroes like Moebius to US readers. And heavy metal became so popular in USA that it's actually still ongoing today. But in the original, the Metal Hurlant in France, it discontinued decades ago. Like in the case of Moebius, he became so popular with his sci-fi style, which he did under his Moebius pen name, that they couldn't even release the Blueberry albums, which he did with his own name, the Jean Giraud, his real name. They had to release them with the Moebius name in the US market so that people would know who he is. So I'm just thinking, what if they would have shrink these albums into the more US size packages? Would we see a completely different type of success for European comics today? And one more fact to back up my theory of the size is too big is Cinebook. Cinebook is one of my favorite publishers. It's translating really good European comics into English, and it's doing it in a very good English. I mean, the translations are really good. And the whole reason for this company to exist is to spread the European comics to all the world. Even though they put a lot of effort to make these quality publications, I mean, the translations is really good, the printing is really good, they still were unsure about the size of the comics. Like this Largo Winds album is a good example. If I put a European album size book behind it, you can see the difference. So even Cinebook, in the beginning, they started with smaller size albums. They were not the real European size album. They wanted the physical size to better to fit the idea of, let's say, US readers. And to show you that, I'll put here trade paperback on top of it. So you can see that it's almost 1-to-1. But having said that, today Cinebook has corrected its ways, and now it's releasing all the new series in the original European album format size. If I put this behind here, so you can see. But looking at the comic book market today, let's say even USA, it's kind of funny and even annoying that the size of the album, the European album, was the thing that slowed its progress. Because if you look the US market, they are now publishing those absolute formats, the library editions, the Martini editions, huge books. And now it's everybody's thinking that, yeah, size matters, you know, it's bigger art, it's better. And no one is complaining that they don't fit the shelves. Now all the comic book channels are showing how many library editions they have, or how many absolute editions they have in their collections. And the bigger, the better. And as a kind of a side note to that, the smallest format of them all, manga, the tankobon size, that is the thing that is spreading fastest at the moment. But there are other reasons to that, and it's a thing that I might come back to in the later videos. But as the size matters, I just want to show you the comparison. Here is a manga book, which I like a lot, by Omega. And it's a tankobon size. Then behind it, we put, so this is the Japanese size, so to speak. And then there is the US publications, their comic book, a trade paperback, but it's the same size as the single issues. Then behind that, I put a small album, an old Asterix album. Even the albums have different sizes, but the differences aren't usually massive. But if you take the smallest and the biggest one, there are quite big differences. Like here is a bit bigger album. This is from Is No Good. If I put it behind here, you can see that it's quite a lot bigger than the Asterix there, which is quite a lot bigger than the trade paperback. But even this is not the biggest. Then there are some of the hardcovers, they go even bigger sizes. So now if we compare to this one, it's quite big difference. But even this is not the biggest album size. Sometimes there are those special graphics that publishers know there would be more value if they were published in even bigger format. Like one of the Moebius works, Arzark. And if I put this album here, it's really big. And if we take these away from the middle, and if you're looking at the absolutely gorgeous graphics, would you rather have the album size or the trade paperback? And if I sound like a salesman to European albums, you have been listening. The album format usually also affects the content of the comic, as the whole story is published in one go. So it's very normal that there's only one album per year. And I understand that if you're accustomed to the US Big Two thing, that when there is every second minute there's some new Batman or new Spider-Man coming out and you just want more content all the time for your favorite character, then this one story per year might sound like just too little. But that also underlines the quite different structures of the comic market. The European market relies on more diverse selection, meaning that there are thousands of albums released every year, but they are not just for one character. So it's quite different. There are many creators doing their own thing, that they are very different things. So in my eye, when I compare it to the USA, it sometimes seems that they have also a lot of creators, really talented writers and artists, but they are more focusing, if they're focusing on those big two, it means that all the stories that come out, when they're all the time coming out, they are all in the same universe, the story universe, or even about the same characters. You can have stories for the same characters coming out at the same time. And that usually never ever happens in Europe. So as a fan of European comics, I understand that I might not be getting a new Lucky Luke or a Spirou album every month. It might be once a year. But since I'm reading so many other characters too, it doesn't really matter. There's all the time something coming up. You can't even read them all. There's so much to read out there. So the comment that there isn't enough content for the European comics is only true if you are only interested in one character. But the strength of the European comics lies in its versatility. There's fantasy, science fiction, romance, slice of life, horror, everything. So it's more closer to manga in that sense. So if you're willing to take the jump into the European comics, just be aware that it's more creator driven, and those creators are all doing their own thing. They are building their own characters, their own worlds. So even if you're reading 100 different characters, they are all having their adventure in their own universe. But I want to end this video in a positive note, because there is light at the end of the tunnel. There are already certain publishers in the USA which have published comic books, European comic books, in a format that is clearly an album format. And I want to point one out. It's Black Sad, and this is by Dark Horse. And I want to thank you, Dark Horse, for doing this. It's a very important step. Black Sad is one of those comics that I have to talk about in later videos. The art is mind-blowing, and this requires a bigger format. I mean, printing this in a smaller format, you have to call police. It's just against the law. I bought this Amarillo volume in English because this was sold out in Finland all the time. Just couldn't find the Finnish version, so I went with the English one. And this is a clear European album size comic book. Here I can put one of the asterisks on top of it so you can see that it matches. The only minus thing about this one is that the way they do it in Finland, the Black Sad, is that this is the size that they printed in Finland. And they go really big with Black Sad because they know that the readers here, they want this art to be massive. But this is still very, very enjoyable in this size, and I recommend you reading this. Not only to support just the album format, but Black Sad is really worth it if you're after mind-blowing art and anthropomorphic animals. And one more detail to mention before I end this is that because albums are published usually maybe once a year, it also means that the stories are quite self-contained. So when you read one album, it gives you a satisfactory ending. And even if that album is part of a longer series, like Tintin has 2 album stories, and let's say Blueberry, it had, 11 album story arc. Each of those albums are still self-contained so that you are satisfied that you get a real good adventure, that part of the story. And many times the creators, if they feel that there is a long delay between the albums, they put some kind of a synopsis at the beginning of the next album so that if you continue 1 year after that, you don't really have to go back to the previous album because the first page just shows you what happened earlier quickly. And so you can jump into the new adventure. So there is a system to that. But okay, that was a lot of info just for one comic book format. But I had to do it because European album is such a great product. And I urge everyone to at least take a dip into it and see what's inside. So for anyone still watching this, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.